Gur Mágat Las Cian O'Callaghan, and I want to begin by saying there's a danger here that we almost get used to this response from government. It's not a response. It's not a response. And become desensitised to it. It's not acceptable what's happened here. We have record levels of homelessness, record levels of rent. We've clear data, very clear data showing that rent regulation has been utterly flouted across this country. And what happens? The Minister responds to this motion, and I want to thank Deputy O'Brien for tabling it, responds to this motion with a few mainly comments just attacking the opposition, and then legs it out of here 2 minutes later. That's his response to record homelessness, record rents, and clear data now showing, unequivocally showing, that rent regulation has been utterly flouted, and he just legs it out of the chamber. That's not okay. Anyone watching this, any member, anyone living in this country, any renter, anyone who's concerned about the housing situation or homelessness, absolutely has a right from this government to expect a serious, considered response to this. That's not what has happened. Homelessness levels have never been so high. We've more than 13,000 people for the first time living in homeless emergency accommodation, almost 4,000 children growing up without a home who are going to spend Christmas in emergency accommodation, 190 pensioners, and this is very clearly related to the rental sector, related to the fact that we've some of the highest rents in Europe, and very much related to that that's just been published that shows that rents in the last 12 months in new tenancies are up by 11.6%. The highest increase since records began in 2007. Just 3 years ago, when this government took office, average rents were €1,226. They're now €1,574 per month. That's an increase of €350 per month, almost €4,000 per year. The data released shows that rents for existing tenancies went up by 5.3% in the last year. That's existing tenancies, not new tenancies. And rents for existing tenancies in Dublin, and all of Dublin is rent pressure zone, so they're not meant to go up in existing tenancies under any circumstances above 2%. Rents in existing tenancies in Dublin were up 5.5%. So this clearly shows the rent regulation, as we've all been saying for a long time, laws are being flouted left, right and centre. The Minister, when he came in, said that this RTP data is the most reliable source of data on rents. That's his words. He then dismissed it in terms of what it says about rent regulation by saying that the data is not a measure of compliance. Now that is technically true because the data wasn't designed to be a measure of compliance. It's a purely semantical argument. This is, as the Minister said, the most comprehensive data on rents. Yes, it was not designed as a measure of compliance, so therefore technically is not a measure of compliance. But let's be very clear, the most comprehensive data we've ever had clearly shows that rent regulation is being utterly flouted and isn't working. So what did the Minister tell us he's going to do about this? Well, actually, he didn't say he was going to do anything about it. He spent the rest of his time attacking the opposition. Didn't tell us he was going to do anything about this at all. Nothing. Nada. Zero. He's the Minister for Housing, responsible for the highest level of people who are homeless in the record of this country. He has clear and hard data showing that his rent regulation laws are not working and are not being adhered to, and he doesn't tell us he's going to do anything about it at all. Now that is a totally unacceptable situation. He now has hard data. If he thinks there's something wrong with that data and he says it's the most reliable data we have, but if it's not sufficient around compliance, then he should make sure that it is made sufficient, or that sufficient data is collected. But more importantly, now that he has that data and that hard data and the RTB has it, he should be telling us what he's going to do to make sure that the rent regulations are enforced. So if he doesn't want to agree with people on the opposition who want to see an absolute rent freeze for the next number of years, if he doesn't want to agree with that, at least tell us how he's going to make his laws and his rules be enforced and workable. He doesn't tell us that. Just seems to shrug his shoulders, as if it's got nothing to do with him at all. He's the Minister for Housing. It's worth making the point, last Cian O'Callaghan, that rent regulation across Europe, and this is where their rent regulation actually is adhered to. The governments enforce the laws around it. They don't just shrug their shoulders. It's got nothing to do with them. Is a normal part of rental sectors across Europe. Countries with larger rental sectors than us regulate their rents. It's just normal. Switzerland, for example, where 52% of households rent, they regulate their rents. This is just a normal thing to do. And in fact, the norm is where you pay your rent in these countries, you cannot then be subject to eviction. All that happens when a landlord sells is you pay your rent into a different bank account. That's all that happens. I want to ask Cian O'Callaghan address the issue of rent increases outside of rent pressure zones, and the data clearly shows that the rent regulation has been flouted everywhere within rent pressure zones and otherwise. In some parts of the country where there aren't rent pressure zones, some renters have been hit with staggering rent increases of 75%, utterly unaffordable for anyone to be able to deal with in any way at all. And the way the rent pressure zones rules are written, they will never be covered by a rent pressure zone, because the rent pressure zone rules require a certain amount of data points. Because of the local electoral areas they live in, there's never that amount of data points or that amount of registered rent increases for them ever to come into the RPZ rules. And also because the way the rules are written, they're in areas that simply will never have average rents greater than areas like Cork City, Galway City, Limerick City. So they'll never qualify to be a rent pressure zone. And that's something that the Minister, if he doesn't agree with opposition proposals on rents, that's something immediately the government could fix if they wanted to. Another thing that would help for renters and would help in terms of homelessness, and this happens where renters who haven't broken their rental agreement, but they don't get a deposit back from a landlord, it's withheld. That means if they're looking for somewhere new to live and they simply don't have a deposit, they can end up in homelessness. And this is something that was legislated for in 2015. So it's on the statute books. It would actually be a good situation for landlords as well, because in situations where landlords unfairly don't have a deposit withheld by a renter, let's say they don't pay the rent in the last month or whatever, it would mean that it would be a fair system for landlords also. It's a system that would pay for itself, because in fact in jurisdictions where it's been introduced, not only does it pay for itself, it allows some income to actually cover costs of regulation, because there's obviously interest accrued off the deposits that are held by the Deposit Protection Scheme. When I asked the Minister about this earlier this year in April, he told me that he was looking at it. And that's no good to renters who become homeless because they've handed over a deposit, haven't breached their rental agreement, don't get their deposit back, could be waiting a huge amount of time as that goes through a dispute resolution with the RTB, and cannot get a deposit together for somewhere new. The fact that the Minister in office now, coming up to 4 years, is looking at it is of no use to anyone who may become homeless. I suppose that's better though than what the Minister said about the rent regulation being flouted, because he didn't even tell us this evening that he's looking at that. He didn't say he was doing anything about it. Didn't indicate anything. So it's not too much to ask last Cian O'Callaghan, in the context that we have of our highest ever number of people who'll be spending this Christmas in homeless emergency accommodation, almost 4,000 children, 190 pensioners, highest ever rents on record. We've some of the highest levels of rent in Europe. It's not too much to ask in the context of the most complete data we've ever had on rents, that the Minister accepts it's the most complete data, that clearly shows the rent regulations aren't working and are being flouted. It's not too much to ask that the government would actually tell us what they're going to do about this. I think you should accept, I think it'd be good to support the proposals from the opposition that we've all put forward. That'd be the best thing to do. But if you're not going to do that, just tell us what it is you're actually going to do as a government to address this. You now have the hard data. Are you going to ensure that the RTB, the Residential Tenancies Board, is resourced properly to go after every single landlord in the country that's breaching your rent regulation laws? And when are they going to do that? Or is it just another case of shrug your shoulders as government, it has nothing to do with you? Gurva Margaret.